Okay, guys, well, we're ready for social studies again today, and we're going to be reviewing this week what we've already learned. Last week, we went through all the book lessons on creating a new government. We looked at the Articles of Confederation and how they didn't work. We looked at the new plan for government, the Constitution, the branches of government. We looked at that yesterday again. Today, we're just going to take 3 days, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. This week, rather, we're going to take these 3 days. We're going to review with another little lesson on some important parts of our country's government. And then also on Thursday, I'll give you a study guide for your test on Friday. So we're going to have our government test this Friday. So I encourage you, some of you didn't do so hot on your last social studies test. This is one of those things in fourth grade that's a little bit different. Your social studies test, you have to study. You have to remember these things. They don't just pop in your brain automatically. You've got to learn them and you've got to study them. So I will give you a study guide on Thursday for the test, and you'll take the test in on Friday. So let's get into some review this week. And the first thing we're going to start with is the Articles of Confederation. And so I want to read a little article to you called Weak Articles. And I'm going to do this. I'm going to read it to you. The slides are after my video here, so you can go back to the slides to answer 10 questions that I'll have for you about this text, okay? We'll do these 3 days to review the lessons. Each one of these question activities that you'll do count as a grade for social studies. So you'll want to make sure you pay attention to the video, go back and reread the slides to find the answers for the questions. Don't just guess, okay? So that'll be today, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. It's what we'll be doing. So pay close attention. Let's get started with weak articles. After the Declaration of Independence, the United States was organized under a system of government called the Articles of Confederation. These articles were the first American government and were the government that ran the United States during the Revolutionary War. Today, most Americans don't know much about these articles and how they worked. Here are some of the high points. Under the Articles of Confederation, each of the 13 states was like a separate entity, almost like a separate country. Under the Articles, there was no president or chief executive, but there was a Congress which met in Philadelphia. Remember the First Continental Congress, Second Continental Congress. Under the Articles, Congress had the power to declare war and make treaties. Congress also had the power to borrow money. However, Congress did not have the power to set up an army or raise taxes. So remember, they set up this government this way. They didn't want it to be like having King George again and the British Parliament that just taxed and taxed and taxed. And you remember all the taxes we read about during the Revolutionary War. They didn't want anything like that again. So they created this weak government that couldn't even have an army, couldn't set up an army, and couldn't raise taxes. So even though we have referred to George Washington's army as one continental army, he actually commanded 13 separate armies raised and paid for by each of the states. That's one of the things that made Washington's job difficult. It's easy to see, it was easy to see how it was that the Articles of Confederation failed. However, at least two important laws were passed during this short phase of American history. The first was the Land Ordinance of 1785. It set up a system under which settlers could buy land west of the Appalachian Mountains and north of the Ohio River. So remember, before we became the United States, King George had the proclamation of 1763. He said, you can't cross the mountains. That's Indian land. Well, now our government is selling that land, and people can buy it from the government. The second, and that was called the Land Ordinance of 1785. The second was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. It set into place the process under which states would be carved out of this territory. The Northwest Ordinance also banned slavery in the land north of the Ohio River. So that's a good thing. So the United States government wanted to have new states being formed because more people were moving west. When you had a certain number of people living in an area, it could become a new state. And so the United States government, even though they didn't stop slavery in the Constitution, they said anything that becomes a state north of the Ohio River cannot have slavery in its new state. So there was one good thing that came out of the Articles of Confederation. Under the Articles of Confederation, the national government also started a process under which Revolutionary War veterans were given Western land as a payment for service during the war. These land grants, as they were known, were a reason many Americans migrated west to places such as Tennessee in the late 1780s and early 1790s. So that was another good thing. So these veterans, these men who had served in the Revolutionary War, they were given as payment because, remember, the government didn't have any money. So what they did have was a bunch of land. So they gave these people land, which is a good thing. So many of these veterans of the Revolutionary War would move across the mountains and live on this new land the government would give them as payment. But that caused problems because many Native Americans viewed land grant settlers as trespassers. After all, they thought it was their land too. So thousands of settlers and American Indians would die fighting over the land grants for the next several decades of American history. So it just seems like it continues, doesn't it? Going all the way back to the 13 colonies, there was this fighting between the settlers and the settlers and Native Americans. And now here, after we've become a country, after the Revolutionary War, there's still fighting between the settlers and the Native Americans. It's going to go on for another 70 or 80 years in our social studies that we're studying. However, the national government's lack of power eventually doomed the Articles of Confederation. Each state issued its own money, which discouraged trade between the states and created problems for farmers and merchants. States argued about where borders were and about who owned the bodies of water between them. The process of admitting new states to the Union was a tedious one, and it made very possible for one of the existing states to effectively block the admission of a new state, as North Carolina did when people tried to form a new state called Franklin. That was what Tennessee was called at first. Did you know that? The people who had moved across the mountains into Tennessee wanted to start their own state and call it Franklin. Who do you think they named it after? Well, Benjamin Franklin, right? So Tennessee, before it was ever Tennessee, for just a little while until the government said it couldn't be a state, you lived in Franklin. That would be funny, wouldn't it? In 1786, a group of Massachusetts farmers, unable to pay their debts to both the state and private lenders, rebelled. They were led by Daniel Shays. We've read about this before, a veteran of the Revolutionary War who had fought at Lexington and Concord. In February 1787, thousands of men, inspired by Shays, tried to capture the new arsenal at Springfield, where thousands of guns were stored for the national government. At the last minute, an army raised by the state of Massachusetts put down the rebellion, but the incident shocked many Americans, including George Washington. In the spring of 1787, states selected and sent delegates to a convention in Philadelphia. Although most of the delegates went to this convention intending to reform the Articles of Confederation, some of them had something else in mind. Some of them wanted to replace the Articles of Confederation with a new system. So, there's your review lesson on the Articles of Confederation. Basically, the main things you need to remember is that it was our first plan for government, that it purposely made our government very, very weak so that it wouldn't be like having a king again. The government couldn't create taxes, couldn't form an army to protect itself. There was a lot more that it couldn't do than it could do. But we read today about a couple good things that it did do. Starting new states, and any states that were north of the Ohio River, slavery was prohibited. You couldn't have slavery there. They also gave land to veterans of the Revolutionary War under the Articles of Confederation. So there were some good things, but the bad outweighed the good. And that's why these guys decided to meet again and make a better plan for government. And of course, we read too about the Shays Rebellion. These farmers who'd fought in the Revolutionary War, who couldn't pay their debts and had their land taken away from them. And so, they couldn't pay their debts because how do farmers earn money? Well, they grow crops and they sell their crops. That's called a cash crop. And that's how they get their money. Well, if you're all fighting at a war for 3 years, you're not home growing crops, are you? So when they returned from the war, they didn't have crops to sell for money, so they didn't have any money, and the government didn't have any money to pay them for the war, so they were broke and couldn't pay their debts. So something's got to change, and you know what's going to happen. Tomorrow we'll read about the Constitutional Convention and remind ourselves and review what all happened there and the many events of the Constitutional Convention that led to a new plan of government, a better plan of government for our country. All right, the next few slides have the same text on it if you need to go back and reread it as you answer your questions for today. See you later.